Hi there, my name is Max Kreminski. I'm a computational media PhD student at UC Santa Cruz. I'm going to open this talk with a potentially controversial statement, namely that making digital games is actually kind of hard. And I think there's two key reasons for this. Number one, from the perspective of the MDA framework, designers and players actually perceive games really differently. Ultimately, as a designer, what you're trying to do is to achieve a certain aesthetic effect on the player. You want to make them feel a certain way, maybe, or to persuade them of a certain way of looking at the world that you're trying to sort of produce for them through the procedural rhetoric of your game design. However, as a designer, aesthetics are downstream of dynamics, which in turn are a downstream emergent effect of mechanics. And the mechanics are the only things that you as the designer can actually directly modify. So what you're trying to do as a designer basically is to implement mechanics, low-level things like rules and code and art assets that eventually, when filtered through this succession of emergence layers, produces the downstream aesthetic effects that you ultimately want to have on the player. This is kind of tricky to do. In addition, making games is also hard because of the Grok Loop. When you're making a digital game, you're engaged, as you are whenever you're making a creative artifact, in what Kate Compton calls a Grok Loop, which is sort of a reflection and action loop where you're continually deciding, in conjunction with the environment, what it is that you're making and how you think you should go about making it. There's two places that these loops tend to break down. Number one is at the gulf of execution. In the case of digital game design, this involves asking yourself a question like, okay, I know I want this level to feel more hostile. Given that, how do I go about changing the design? And especially once I know what design change I'm trying to make, how do I actually go about changing low-level things like the code or the art assets or whatever to actually implement this intended design change? This has all the difficulty of programming and of asset creation and all these other very sort of like rich, deep areas of creative practice. And as a result, it's sort of inherently difficult. In addition, these loops also tend to break down at the other side, at the gulf of evaluation. Basically, once you've made a change to your game, you have to determine the effects of the change, both in order to tell whether it was successful and also in order to determine basically whether there are unintended emergent effects that you didn't anticipate that are now shaping the player experience in unwanted ways that have to be accounted for somehow. And to do this, you often have to play the game yourself, which can be very time consuming. You might have to bring in third-party playtesters to get sort of an unbalanced or an unbiased third-party perspective, which can be very difficult and time consuming also. And it's just generally sort of a point at which it's hard to get immediate feedback on what effects your game design changes actually had. And the conjunction of these difficulties makes it especially hard for people who I'm calling procedurally literate inexpert programmers to be as involved in game design as a creative practice as they might want. These are people who definitely understand games, who understand how games can be used to create meaning, how rules can sort of lead people to be persuaded of certain arguments, how they can produce aesthetic effects or feelings in players, but who are not especially great at programming, and who might not necessarily know exactly how to do all these low-level mechanical manipulations that you need to make their aesthetic effects to make the aesthetic effects they want to achieve come true. And these people include people like journalists who are trying to create news games or like procedural playable op-eds about some real world issue or event. It includes people who are making protest games, which are games that basically sort of make procedural arguments for why something about the real world should be changed and should be different than it is currently. And it also includes people making personal games, games about personal experiences like queerness or depression that are interactive art that tries to implement some playable model of how you feel about something, basically. So wouldn't it be great if we could enable like all these people to engage in game design as a creative practice by providing them with some sort of like rhetoric first game design tool, right? Like a tool that lets them focus on the high level procedural rhetoric they're trying to create, the high level aesthetic effects they're trying to create, and frees them up from the difficulty of low level mechanical manipulations and especially the difficulty of programming. There's been a couple of attempts to create tools like this in the past. Gammamatic is a really great example. Gammamatic allows you to basically specify your rhetorical intent for a game at this very high-level diagrammatic sort of process. You put some entities on the board, which in this case includes things like robot and fuel and zombie and scientist, and you draw arrows between them. And these arrows are assigned certain verbs that basically relate these entities to one another in certain system understood ways. So in this case, the robot attacks the zombie eats the scientist, the robot needs fuel to survive, and the scientist makes both robots and fuel. And then when you press this make game button, the system can make games for you that implement, as a working playable piece of software, the rhetorical game design that you specified here, basically. Games in which the robot and the fuel and the zombie and the scientist are running around on the screen as sprites and interacting with one another in the ways that you specified. This is great, but it also means that the intent language is very limited, right? Because this diagram system only lets you specify entity-entity relationships, and it only lets you specify arrows that have verbs of the handful of types that the system actually recognizes. And as a result of these two things, it's very hard to specify nuanced or sophisticated rhetorical arguments using Gammamatic games. So that's where Gemini comes in. Gemini is another system that basically attempts to address some of these problems with Gammamatic by letting you specify your rhetorical intent instead as an answer set program that just specifies a whole bunch of additional constraints on a massive generative space of games that are defined by the Cygnus game description language. Basically, Gemini says, okay, I will give you Cygnus games, any valid Cygnus games you want, and you have to specify for me which ones you're looking for using all the expressive power of answer set programming. And because this language has a lot of expressive power, you can do some very powerful things with it, right? You can do some very sophisticated expressions of very complicated intents. However, this also makes it really hard to write these intents, because in order to do it, you need to understand both ASP and Cygnus syntax and semantics. And as a result, Gemini is much less approachable as a system than Gammamatic. So what we really want is something that has sort of the best of both worlds in it, and that's what led us to Germinate. Like Gemini and Gammamatic, we sort of set out to create a game design sketchbook, something that privileges exploration of a game design space over exploitation of a narrow part of that space, that privileges the process of figuring out what it is you're even making over a particular end polished product that you want to get out of it. And similarly, that has both sort of the approachability of Gammamatic's diagrammatic language for specifying design intent, in addition to Gemini's more sophisticated, nuanced language for specifying rhetorical goals. In addition to that, we also wanted to do something that neither Gammamatic nor Gemini really does all that well, which is support the iterative refinement of the initial design intent to make it better and better and sort of closer and closer to what you actually want as you go. Basically, to scaffold this Grok Loop and the special pain points of the gulf of execution and the gulf of evaluation, so that you don't get stuck at those points as much as you normally would. And as a result, we ended up with something that looks kind of like this. On the left-hand side, you can see that we've got a design intent, which is sort of broken down into a bunch of cards, right? We've got entities, resources, relationships, and triggers, which are the 4 different kinds of things that Germinate basically recognizes as parts of a game. Entities here can have an icon, which is sort of their graphical representation in the game. They can have tags, including things like player thinks is good. So the entity friend here, for instance, is supposed to be something that the player views as helping them or helping them sort of achieve their goals in the game. Resources are numeric quantities that can go up and down throughout the course of gameplay. The goals of a game are often defined in terms of these resources. You might want to make a resource go over a certain value or to sort of keep it below a certain value are 2 common goals in Gemini games. Relationships are similar to Germinate or similar to Gammamatic relationships. They specify like a way that 2 entities are related to one another, but they can also specify relationships between entities and resources or between 2 pairs of resources, for instance. And finally, triggers are these low-level specifications of individual mechanics. They take the form of a when and a then part, and the when part is basically when this condition happens in the world, then do some other stuff. So, for instance, you can have a mechanic that's of the form when a resource falls below a certain value, or when 2 entities of this type and this type collide with one another, then do this other thing on the right-hand side, like maybe make a resource go up or something like that. And then, once you hit the Make Games button, you can see on the right-hand side all of the games that the system has generated using your intent as inspiration, basically. You can browse through them with the Next Game and Previous Game buttons. You can give them titles. You can play them sort of live in the web browser because these are JavaScript games made with Phaser. And then also, you can look at these generated game rules, which have been parsed out of the ASP form that they're initially sort of provided in, into the same visual language that we use to specify the intent in the first place. And as a result of that, what you can do is sort of harvest mechanics from these generated games, right? You can scroll through a bunch of generated games, and when you find one that you like, or one that has sort of a feature that you like in it, you can narrow in on that feature specifically, for instance, the generated stranger entity that you see in this example game here, and click this button in the top right corner to actually import that whole thing into your intent. And then if you regenerate like a new batch of games, all of the games that are generated will have this stranger entity in it in some form. And this is a very powerful mechanism for basically browsing through the space of games that are generated in response to your intent and sort of iteratively refining your intent by taking the best parts of the generated game space and harvesting them into your intent for later use. To do all this, we have to translate intents from this graphical form into the ASP form Gemini, which is the sort of underlying system actually recognizes. And often this is pretty simple. So you can see here we've got two entities, student and book, which are both supposed to be good. We've got knowledge, which is a resource that's supposed to be good, and tiredness, which is a bad resource. And this translates really straightforwardly into ASP code. Like, this is not super complicated. But then if you have a more complicated intent, it might take some more work to do this. So for instance, at the bottom here, we've got a negated trigger, which is basically saying, make sure that we do not generate any games where clicking on the student entity directly increases the value of the knowledge resource. And that produces a kind of gnarly looking constraint on the right-hand side in the actual ASP that's generated. We also have to translate the ASP that the system generates for us as the rules of the generated games back into these cards so the system can display them to the player in this visual form. To evaluate Germinate, we performed this really preliminary process of basically testing it with 4 game generation researchers who hadn't used Gemini before. And we administered a think aloud study and then a brief user experience questionnaire with these 5 questions in it. Ultimately, we found that all of these users found Germinate at least somewhat fun to use. 3 of 4 said unreservedly fun. One had sort of qualms about it. It was generally found to be easy to use for very open-ended game design exploration, but hard to use to recreate specific target games precisely. There was also this sort of mixed sense of control between different users. So some users felt that they had a lot of control over the games it was producing, and some felt that they had very little. And we found one particularly strong positive outcome, which is that Germinate tends to generate productively surprising realizations of the design intent. So in one particular example, a user basically specified, I want a game in which books are good, a student is good, knowledge is good, and tiredness is bad. And they expected to see a game in which the student chases books in order to acquire knowledge. However, what they actually got as their first game out was a game in which the student sort of warily circles around the books, and you as the player are charged with corralling the books toward them. And I think this is a really great example of the kinds of design space explorations that tools like this can potentially enable, right? Like genuinely surprising design moves that open up possibilities the human user wouldn't have thought of on their own. So if you're interested in learning more about Germinate, I posted the full paper at my website. If you want to play with the tool yourself, it's available for download on GitHub. It's an aid software artifact if you're willing to jump through some hoops to get it set up on your computer. And of course, I'd be happy to take questions and chat further via Twitter or email. Thank you.